Welcome, everybody, to the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. I'm delighted to be here today with Nicky Moxey and Linda Devereux. Nicky Moxey is an ex-boarder and a third culture kid. She originally spent 33 years as a project manager and agile coach, as an author and an amateur archaeologist. She is retraining as an integrative counsellor and tends to work with boarding school survivors after she qualifies later this year. Linda Devereux is an adult third culture kid who grew up in Africa, Scotland, and Australia. Linda worked for many years as an educator in schools and universities. She researches and publishes in the fields of academic literacy and the transition to university, and in transnational childhood trauma, and life writing. Working with Nikki and the other contributors to the book on the challenges of boarding school for women and third culture kids brought together many of Linda's life passions. And she's very thankful to have the opportunity to work with a group of individuals who have shared their deeply personal experiences out of a desire to create change. Welcome this morning, Linda and Nikki.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Beautiful. Well, I always like to start the podcast kind of how we connected and learned about each other. And I think at the very start of around a year ago, wonderful Piers Cross sort of turned me on to your work, Nikki, and a previous conversation you'd had, and it had also come up with speaking to Nick Duffel, Amelia White, and others. So I knew it was really important that we spoke. And then when I saw the new book coming, which is entitled "Exploring Boarding School Challenges for Women and Third Culture Kids: Worlds Away from Home," I thought, what a great time now to connect all together. So yeah, it's lovely to be here. Amazing. So yeah, as far as how I like to get started on the podcast is just to get a little bit more of your journey, and understand how it was you came to be writing about this. So from Linda first, how were your early years? How did this sort of subject start to be shaped for you?
Well, I'm a third culture kid, so the simplest definition of that is that I grew up in a country that was not my passport country because of my parents' work.
So how I love to start the podcast is to find a little bit more out about where my guests come from. So I'd love to hear about your early years experiences, Linda, and how that kind of shaped into the work that you're now doing.
Thank you. Yes, I'm a third culture kid, so that means that I lived in a country that wasn't my passport country because of my parents' work. And my parents were medical missionaries. They were working in a very remote bush hospital in Africa. So, it was a exciting life for me in many ways. I had a happy time living in Africa where I did. I played with my siblings a lot. I had lots of outdoor time. It was a very free childhood in many ways. But because my parents were missionaries, they went, like lots of third culture kids, they went to that other country and were sent there by a sponsor organisation. So my parents worked for the BMS, and that was the UK Baptist Missionary Society. And those sponsor organisations can have a lot of control over the lives of third culture kids and their families. BMS made decisions about where my parents went, when they could take holidays, when they could go to conferences, and they made decisions about things like schooling. So they had a policy at the time that all the missionary kids had to go to boarding school. And for me, all those kids went to boarding school back in the UK, which meant that some of them, even from very young ages, 2-year-olds, 4-year-olds, got left with guardians and then sent to boarding school. My parents fought against that a bit, and they arranged for me to go to a boarding school 4 days drive away, on the edge of the border between Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda. And so I got sent off to boarding school as a 6-year-old, and it was an awful experience for me. because I'd led quite a sheltered life. I'd never been to school because there was no English language school anywhere near where we lived. So I wasn't used to a school environment. I'd never been away from my parents. Two of my siblings were born at home, and Dad looked after us when the other one was born in Scotland. So I'd never been separated from my family. So being sent off with strangers was just a horrific experience for me. And as an adult now, I think, well, what were my parents thinking to do that? And like so many people, I was just miserable at boarding school. It was an American boarding school. It was run by a sort of fundamentalist Christian missionary group. There was hardly any of us who weren't Americans, and so we were seen as slightly lesser beings and not proper Christians because BMS was seen as far too liberal. So I was set up as different from the very beginning, and very lonely. I hadn't learned to really read and write, so I had no idea what I was writing to my parents when I copied sentences off the board, although they were relieved to see that I was happy and well settled, because that's what I'd copied off the board. And I couldn't read what they wrote to me either. And I don't remember anybody ever thinking to read their letters to me. So I was just completely isolated in the days before mobile phones and those other ways of communicating. And there were other traumas for our family too, although we didn't call them traumas in those days. We got caught up in civil war and held hostage for several months during the sort of years where African countries were quite naturally fighting for their independence and resisting the control by, during the Cold War times, the sort of fighting that was underground fighting that was going on between Russia and America. And anyway, we got held hostage for a while, witnessed violence, were eventually rescued in quite dramatic circumstances by mercenary soldiers and helicopters and sent back to Scotland, which was a huge shock for all of us. Going to school in Scotland was very different. But overall, the next 10 years where I went to school in Scotland were stable, happy years. I had good support, access to extended family, and so it was a stabilizing time in my life, I guess.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Linda. It's heartbreaking to think of you in that school, unable to read and write, the
Mm.
communications home, that tiny little thread of connection with home, not being available to you, and just being taken out of that home environment and being sent somewhere with strangers. Really hearing that. So when you got to Scotland, was it boarding school you went into there as well, or was it a day school?
No, I didn't. One of the things that I'm eternally grateful to my parents for is that they could actually tell that I hadn't been at boarding school all that long, but they could tell that it had changed me. And they didn't want to have to do that again. My next brother down in the family would have had to go to school as well. They tried to negotiate with the Baptist Missionary Society to see if we could go to a bigger centre where we could go to a day school, but nothing was available. So in the end, they made what was for them a really, really difficult decision, and they gave up their vacation. But I don't think I think they deeply regretted not being able to be missionaries anymore. My dad felt deeply called to go and be a doctor where there weren't many doctors. Um, but I think for myself and my siblings, it was a really wise choice. I don't think my parents were in a terribly good psychological state, as you would imagine, after what they'd been through. And that time in Edinburgh was just a really stable, happy time for the family. And I think, although there were obvious signs of rupture and torment and misery in the first few years that we were recovering, I think we did recover, and we had in many ways, I can talk more about that later, but in many ways having that stable time. I went to local school, made good friends, I loved having access to my grandparents, and it was just, yes, it was a healing time.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Linda. And so for you, Nikki, then how were the early years for you? How did that shape, coming to write this book and be interested in this topic?
I was born in Kenya. My father worked for an oil company out there, so my background is mercantile, third culture kids. But most importantly for me, he was also a part-time game warden. I have no idea why, but we moved house every 6 to 9 months throughout my childhood. I think I lived in 20 houses before I was 18, 9 primary schools. And so for me, the constant was the bush, was being out in nature, was just, I have such lovely memories of watching giraffes stand on tippy-toe to nibble acacia trees, or hearing elephants' tummies as they wander past almost in touching distance. But that bouncing around Kenya was not good prep for learning how to deal with peers. And so when I was sent to boarding school at the age of 11, not only did I lose everything that I'd loved, the landscape, the animals, the freedom, running around barefoot, the climate, I also had no idea how to deal with other kids, basically. And my father compounded my problems by writing to the housemistress and telling her that if I were naughty, then she could use physical punishment on me, up to and including the cane. And in typical boarding school fashion, she chose to read me his letter in public, so I was doubly shamed by it. And the whole experience just, well, I think I probably regressed to a very early stage. I went back to wetting my knickers. I got a UTI that caused everything around me to stink. My dorm mates tried to give me a cold bath, and I fought back and managed to kick one of them down the stairs by accident. And it was only at that point that the housemistress chose to intervene. I got sent to the SAN for the rest of the half term, came back and discovered I had a reputation for violence. No child spoke to me for the rest of the 7 years of school, pretty much, except for things like pass the salt. And I had a terribly isolated time, and that the implications of that are still reverberating. I cannot stand groups to this day any more than 3 or 4 people, and I'm certain that I'm going to be attacked. It can be a very uncomfortable experience.
Nikki, yeah, my heart is with that younger child that going through that experience. That is absolutely heartbreaking to hear, and yeah, to go so long in isolation as well, and we know with boarding school syndrome, if you like, the ABCD: abandonment, bereavement, captivity, dissociation. What was your survival strategy, if you like? How did you get through being so isolated for so long?
When the housemistress read me Dad's letter and said that she would beat me if necessary, my response was to tell her that if she tried, I would hurt her back, and she backed off so fast that you couldn't see her for dust. So my survival strategy was to be ignored. At school, I really enjoyed the experience. I've got a good IQ. I loved the academic side of school. It was an academic school that I'd picked by accident, luckily. And And then I just spent as much time as I possibly could staying away from the house. So there were some beautiful trees in the grounds that, in the summer at least, I spent my days climbed up, clutching a book, and head in the clouds away from it all. So yes, I suppose dissociation was absolutely where my head was at, and something of a rebel. I don't think Nick Duffel actually describes someone who just is as under the radar as they possibly can be. But that was me.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and I really resonate with escaping to nature. I've recently reconnected with people at my first boarding school when I was 7, and I blocked out most of it. I can't connect to most of what happened there, but they've been very helpful. Say, oh no, you used to do this and you used to do that, and apparently I would just escape to the woods. And I think, looking at how my relationship with nature is now, I can see that was a real saving grace between that and sport stuff. But you mentioned academics for you, very important. So there's usually something to hang on to in these sort of institutions. But thank you for that. And so then, so Linda, how did that experience sort of set things up for you? You had the contrast of boarding school, Africa, being held hostage, escape to Scotland, then the stability of the Scottish years, with grandparents, with family, etc. As you then came out into adulthood, what were you carrying with you, and how did that sort of shape the work that you got into?
Well, I think I was absolutely terrified that I was going to get sent away again. Like all children, I tended to think that I must have been sent away because there was something wrong with me. So although I think of the time in Scotland as a really happy time, and it was, and it felt safe, I think I coped throughout my childhood by being really good. I thought if I was really, really good, I wouldn't get sent back to boarding school again. And the adults in my life put a lot of pressure on me to be good as well. My mother, of course, was in a fragile state. After all she'd been attacked, she'd witnessed lots of violence, was subjected to a lot of psychological manipulation by the rebel soldiers who were supposedly protecting us, but it felt more like guarding, really. We felt like we were stuck in the house. So people would say to me things like, oh, your mum, you need to help your mum, you need to be good. And I just took that on board. I think I was ultra responsible, took on a lot of responsibility for looking after other people. And I think that's a pattern that's gone on throughout my life. In terms of my career, I decided to be a teacher. I think that was partly because, unlike Nikki, the academic side of school didn't initially save me. I think I was so traumatized it was absolutely impossible to learn, and I hadn't managed to learn to read and write at boarding school. In the first, I think it took me a long while when we went back to Scotland as well. A really good teacher made a difference to that, convinced me that I was smart, and she predicted that, it would all be fine for me in the long run. It might just take me a bit longer than other people. And it was lovely. It was lovely to have an adult tell me that. And so I worked in schools, and then eventually I started working in teacher education in universities, where my research and teaching was about language and diversity and about helping kids to succeed. So I think that was partly came from my childhood of feeling like a good teacher made such a big difference to me, and I wanted to see if I could help other people in that way too.
Thank you. Yeah, that brings a lot of joy when you speak, when that one great teacher, or that one adult that sort of believed in you and inspired you, whoever that is. I'm very grateful that I have one as well. And I often hear that there was one who got through, one who saved me, one who was there. So, they often say kind of where your wound is where your gold is, where you're kind of gold for the world, and you using those experiences to language diversity and to work with young people. So yeah, it was beautiful to hear that. But the people pleasing as well, and the being a good girl, that was one of my strategies. I hear it a lot from people, was, you know, to sort of take on the emotional needs of those around you, to carry those, as well as and to put yours secondary, if you like. That's a difficult pattern. Have you how have you looked into that then as an adult, and how have you started to sort of deal with and unpack that?
Well, I think it sort of came to a head when I came to a period of burnout. I was working in a very responsible position, was having a conflict with a colleague who was verbally bullying me at work, and I just kind of fell in a bit of a heap. I think it was. I can see why that reminded me of a lot of the stuff from my childhood now, but at the time I couldn't see any of that, and I was completely stuck. And that's really when I started counseling. And it took me, such a long time before I made the connection between boarding school. The war stuff was a bit easier. Everybody can see that. You know, if you start talking about getting caught up in civil war, everybody can see, yes, yes, I can understand that would be very traumatic. But particularly because I didn't go to boarding school for as long as somebody like Nikki or the other contributors to the book, I hadn't really taken that seriously. And it was only much more recently, once I started doing a PhD and looking a lot more into what what happens for third culture kids, that I began to realize how much boarding school had played a part in that.
Mm. Thank you. Yeah, yeah, so important what you highlight there. Yeah, Nikki, what's your experience as well, as when you sort of moved out into the world? You know, you talked about your strategy at school being to sort of stay completely invisible, stay off the radar. Um, and you know, what was the shaping of that for you then into adulthood, and what did you carry out with you?
I adored university, as you'd expect, and created a couple of really good uh, a couple of really good lifelong friendships there, and then wandered from university into a corporate career that lasted 30 odd years, where I fairly rapidly became a manager and so had some degree of control over what was happening. And control is something that I require in order to feel safe. So I loved managing small groups of people. I also loved teaching. The agile that you mentioned at the beginning is a very subversive way of working because it's a bottom up way. So teams of people can choose, can take control over their working environments. And I thoroughly enjoyed my career. Retired the year before COVID hit, went walkabouts, got back from traveling just as COVID hit, and got it in the first wave. Missed the first lockdown because I was ill, and then the second lockdown, boarding school absolutely thwapped me in the face. I knew that I could not survive being locked up again, and panicked. Googled everything, found Nick Duffell's boarding school survivors outfit, and got a therapist through them, who worked with me throughout COVID until she retired, and then handed me over onto another therapist with whom I'm still working. And I had no doubt that it was boarding school, and throwing back to boarding school that made me suicidal. My therapist held me through some really dark times. And as a result of that, I went on Nick's boarding school survivors workshop, which was the genesis of the book.
Thank you for sharing that, Nikki. So really hearing across, you know, Linda, you mentioned counselling, and then Nikki, finding the right therapist at the right time. But the commonality also being that, this stuff doesn't come up kind of until it does. So same for me, decades I was in some form of talk therapy, and boarding school didn't come up. Um, for me, because of the sort of, I was told consistently how lucky I was to be there. I carried that out into the world, that was nothing to see here, nothing to see here for years. So they say you'd focus on the big T trauma, Linda, whether it's your experiences in civil war, or for me, it was bereavement or drugs or drink or whatever. So, talk therapy stayed there. And then at some point for me, the breakdown 4 years ago, Nikki, he says lockdown, that panic, and then Linda, the sort of bubbling up of this stuff at work around kind of bullying and that there's usually something, a trigger event. For others, it might be when their children reach the age they went away, or when their parents die and they're not protecting anyone anymore, or whatever. But there is this moment when it suddenly becomes all that needs to be looked at for a bit. And thank you so much for sharing your part of that, because that's pretty helpful for others who are maybe on that journey as well. So then, you brought it in quite nicely, Nikki, to then the genesis of the book being some of the material and stories that were being shared potentially at the boarding school survivors workshops and things like that. So could you take us through how people's sort of experiences in a workshop setting ended up becoming a book?
One of the topics we talked about was why we consented as 8, 11, 13-year-olds to going to boarding school. And a commonality was that we'd been fed the wonderful propaganda of Mallory Towers, Enid Blyton, midnight feasts, how fantastic boarding school was going to be. And once we'd finished saying things like, yeah, right, we decided that we wanted our voices to be heard. And so the 8 people, I think all 8 people on the workshop wanted initially to put their stories forward. And we used the format that the workshop does, that people were describing their early experiences before boarding school, and then the inciting moment, usually at boarding school, when they realised that it was not going to go well for them. So that was the outset of it. And then I needed more stories, so started inviting people to put their stories in. And somewhere along this route, Simon Partridge introduced Linda and I, and Linda's academic expertise started to pick up on the fact that we had huge numbers comparatively of third culture kids, and that there were further themes that could be brought out. And so it was Linda's work that then shaped the stories that we were looking for, to see if there was commonality across the missionary, the mercantile, the military kids. And so we ended up with, I think, 17 stories altogether, including one poem rather than a story. But it was Linda's work that was the thing that turned it from a collection of stories into a research piece.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Nikki. And then we chatted quickly before we started recording this morning that you're still being approached with stories. People have got a lot of stories to tell, so there's something opened up here. It would be good at this point, just some of the terminology for those who haven't heard it before might be a little bit tricky. So we talked about kind of missionary, mercantile, and military, and we've got third culture kids and cross-culture kids. So Linda, would you mind just giving us a bit of a glossary around those and to help us understand those a little bit?
Yes. Well, the terminology third culture kid actually originally came from a woman called Ruth Hill Unseam, who was working with her husband back in the 60s, looking at expatriate communities and the way that they behaved and interacted living in other countries. And she describes it as the first culture is the parents' passport culture. So that's a culture the parents grew up in. And the second culture, sometimes there's more than one second culture, because like Nikki, there's often a lot of moving around in these families. But the second culture is the culture that they move to for work. And then the idea of the third culture is that it's not so much a blend of the first and second cultures, but it's a kind of between space where people interact with similar people in similar situations. Often, well, in the missionary example, it's often with other missionaries, or in the military, it's often on the military bases. So there's this kind of interaction in this strange, different way of being that's not really the first culture, and obviously not the second culture either. So it varies between third culture kids how much where they identify most strongly. If they live, perhaps if they've gone with a big petrochemical company to a country where there's a same language school, their first language schooling's in their first language, and all the kids come from very similar backgrounds, they might retain that very strong connection with their passport country. On the other hand, if it's a small missionary group and the children go to a local school and learn in the local language, those children might actually have much bigger sense of their identity coming from the second culture. But what the third culture kids tend to have in common is this sense of belonging with other third culture kids. And cross-culture kids are third culture kids are often seen as a subset of cross-cultural kids. Cross-cultural kids is a much broader terms that defines anybody who's had those kind of transcultural experiences. So it can be refugees moving to another country, children who grew up with parents from different nationalities and they have that cross-cultural experience in the home, or like the child in our book who was sent from Asia to do schooling in a boarding school in the UK. And I understand, and Nikki can say much more about this than me, that that's a really growing cohort in the UK, and a lot of boarding schools are making a lot of money out of attracting those cross-cultural kids, without perhaps really understanding the implications that come out from the book.
Thank you so much, Linda. That's really helpful for me as well, and hopefully for people listening to sort of understand those different terms. And I think just from what I've seen and heard, as far as the hundreds of people who've come for support, for conversations, attend our groups, things like that, there is a massive over-indexing of people who would be third culture kids. And when I look at my own experience, just going up the road 45 minutes to a boarding school, you're in your own language, you're in your own culture, you know the weather, you know the food, you sort of know roughly where you're at. But this absolute culture shock of coming from the red soil of Africa into a button-down grey environment and uniform, I can feel it just saying it. I mean, what does that do? That doubles down on some great loss and some great shock, I think. Is that experience from the book and your personal experience?
Oh, absolutely. And to double down on that, there is nowhere that you can call home because you've been ripped out of the culture that you grew up in. You certainly don't consider your parents' culture home. It used to really wind me up when my parents would say things like, "Oh, we're going home for holidays." Well, my home was Africa. It certainly wasn't the UK. It took me decades to appreciate that the UK is actually a good place to live in. And it's apart from the June weather, it still can feel a very cold and unwelcoming place. So yes, you nothing is as you've known it.
Thank you. And you touched on, I was doing some work around the numbers at boarding school at the moment, and where young people are coming from, and certainly junior boarding is has been on the decline, is very much on its way out for young people, particularly under 11, but somewhat under 13, declining. And certainly the sort of British middle class love affair with it has dropped off a cliff since COVID. But those numbers are being bolstered by overseas students, coming in. So, for someone, so to get the terminology right, so I understand if a young person comes from Hong Kong, for instance, or China, which are two of the biggest feeders at the moment into this particularly the junior boarding system, what's the terminology for that young person if their family remains in the country of origin?
And if they intend to go back to the country of origin, they're cross-cultural kids.
Thank you very much. Yeah, one of the most challenging things we've had recently is that where a number of examples where those young people have basically been told to go to England, go to boarding school, go to Oxbridge, don't come home until you are the finished article, sort of thing. And then there is an element of pressure to support the family. Then they're the sort of the great hope of the family, and that tends to, we've seen it, eating disorders, burnout, self-harm, just way too much pressure, and that much pressure away from home as well. In the stories and the interviews and that you heard from people, were there elements of that pressure coming in?
Absolutely. The woman that Linda mentioned is a classic example of that. She had a friend who came over with her commit suicide, and she herself has tippy-toed around that. And she cannot, to this day, talk about her own experience with her parents because they cannot understand it. That they are convinced that they are doing absolutely the best thing for her, and they wouldn't. She feels that they would never recognise the damage that she sees in herself. Very sad.
It is, yeah, it is, and from the parents' perspective, yeah, that dissociation from it, that sort of shame and guilt that potentially harm was caused, can sometimes throw up a wall that some never get through. Some do, and it starts to break down over time, and then the relationship can start to heal. But yeah, that can be one of the most difficult parts when people start to look at this part of their life. I always think when, my situation, my dad went bankrupt paying the school fees because it was a commitment made in a divorce. And so it was always, do you know how much we've given up for you? Do you know how much to sacrifice? So that double bind that Nick Duffel often talks about. Yeah.
Yes, and if I could just add one thing there too, like it does for so many people sent to boarding school, coming as a cross-cultural boarder really breaks up families as well, because the student, if they do well and settle into the boarding school, they're absorbing a whole lot of the culture of the boarding school of that country. They may lose their first language or their fluency. They lose a lot of the fluency of their first language because they have to very quickly learn English if that's the language of instruction, and they have to learn all the nuances of English and teenager language so they can survive in boarding school. And none of those skills will necessarily serve them well if they go back to their passport country. I know that some people I've talked to who've worked with those kind of intercultural families say that often the families, the parents, feel this intense sense of grief because they had never predicted that they were actually going to lose their child in that kind of way. All they wanted was to give their child the best education they could, to give them the best chance in life. But a lot of those families end up feeling like they've actually lost their child because the child has lost their language and lost their culture and doesn't fit in their passport country anymore.
Thank you. That's so important, Linda. So, from memories of school, the kids that came from overseas were largely bullied more than others, because anything different is bullied in boarding school, and therefore then potentially when they go home, they're seen as having stepped out of that culture. So there's a good chance that they're not received well back into the passport culture. So it really feels challenging there. something I wanted to just move into, because the book is exploring boarding school challenges for women and third culture kids, and we've talked about the third culture kids a bit, but the women's experience is not talked about enough or as much as the boys' experience, the male experience. So whoever'd like to take this question, but what did you find in the women's experiences in the book, and that your own, and that have come to you since, that shows up differently to the boys, and why are we not talking about the women's experience as much?
I think that the biggest differential is how punishment is dealt with. Girls are typically not beaten, although we do have some examples of that. Instead, the driving force is shame. People are shamed at every opportunity when they put a toe outside the line, and that's really corrosive. I've never been caned at school. I don't know what it feels like, but I imagine that when it's done, it's over. If you're shamed, then that lasts a long time, and you might never recover your social standing from that kind of shame. And the whole system, including all the other girls, are there to enforce shame, to push you into line. And also there is still that residue of the old public school ethos that boys are sent out to rule the empire and girls are sent out to be their loving, supportive wives, which can set you up for a life of trying to hit your head against a glass ceiling, because you are restricted. You know that you cannot perform as well as a man, allegedly. It's very pervasive. And some of Linda's work covers a lot of the other themes. Do you want to pick up things like food, Linda?
Yeah. Yes, the food was a big one that came up. Nikki made me laugh because Nikki made the index for the book and said that food was one of the things that came up most often, which is really such we could probably talk for a whole podcast about that, but certainly for women, one of the themes that seems to come out is that there's intense competition, and because of the sort of socialization of women to look good, to not be needy, to not be greedy, food can become one of the issues that they use to control. Nikki talked earlier about how that sometimes when one's experienced trauma very young, there's a need to control, and food can be one of the very, very few things that that girls and young women can control in boarding school. So even in our small sample, there's quite a few people who would describe having disordered relationships with food and with their bodies. And something that came up for me in a conversation recently too is that maybe this is harder for third culture kids too, because if they've grown up in a culture where the bodies are very different to theirs, they might already feel very self-conscious. I found myself clutching my breasts when I was talking to this woman because we just because of my different body shape compared around me where I grew up. I think that a third culture kid can become very self-conscious about how they look if they've always looked different to everybody else around them. And then suddenly they're put into this pressure cooker environment at boarding school where there is this real competition to be the best young ladies, to as I said before, be neither needy nor greedy. And that there's a huge emphasis in the stories that we've collected too on deportment. Again, it's about how you look and about how you carry yourself. It's not about how smart you are or what you want to do with your life when you leave school. It is very much about those stereotypical gendered ways of being, which can be incredibly limiting.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So one of the things, well, the themes there that you talked about perhaps not being talked about as much because of the physical violence. The punishment bit tends to sort of hit headlines a little bit. Talks about food and control, and I found myself getting emotional as a father of 13-year-old girls, getting very just the thought of that going through adolescence in an institution where the only agency they have is to sort of start to either binge, purge, restrict food, control food in some way. That feels absolutely heartbreaking.
You can't binge because food access is restricted. The control is to starve yourself.
Yeah, I hear you, Nikki. I think, in some schools, tuck was free flowing, and so people would binge on junk, and then every school was very different. Mine, the school with the food was restricted. Others, I heard that you had completely free access to junk food, which is quite, people ended up with massive addictions to junk food, as you can imagine, because it was all that was there. Remarkable. But when I spoke to Amelia White on a podcast, she referenced also, and shame. Shame was really clearer from what you talked about. She referenced shame as well. She also talked about that the abuse is different often for the boys and the girls, and the boys' sort of abuse stories were, the dodgy Latin teacher predating on young boys, older boys, and buggery with younger boys, etc. Amelia was talking about that the abuse there was very, particularly in co-ed schools, very strange relationships between older boys and younger girls, which couldn't be deemed consensual at all because of the power imbalance, because of the age difference, but also then as the girls got older, teachers starting to have relationships and deeming them as loving consensual relationships with older girls, when in fact it's abuse. Could you speak to any of that as the difference in the sort of female experience coming through?
I'm thinking of one person's story where a boy climbed up a drain pipe into a girl's bedroom. The girl was expelled and the boy was told off. That kind of absolute difference in treatment and expectation. The boy was saved because I think the story contributor said that he was a good cook. He made croissant for the headmaster's breakfast, and so he was needed in the school, and the girl was not. And her career, her life was potentially trashed, whilst his was just carried on regardless, although he was the perpetrator. So again, you've got that huge gulf in treatment between what's expected and allowed for the male and for the female.
Yes, and one of the research data sets that we've drawn on quite a lot in the book, because it's such a large one, is some work that was done by an organisation called Third Culture Kid Training, and they've surveyed almost 2,000 adult third culture kids about their experiences. And what they found was that one of the things, they found many things, it's very interesting, but in terms of the question you asked, one of the things they found was that the ones that went to boarding school had many more experiences of being groomed by somebody who was 5 years or more older than them. So I think you're right. I think there's a lot more we need to find out about that kind of thing. And the third culture kids that went to boarding school overall reported higher rates of sexual abuse as well. Now, that part of the survey didn't actually say whether that took place in the school or at home. But since those young people were spending 9 out of every 12 months at boarding school, it would be reasonable to assume that quite a lot of it took place there. So yes, there's obviously a lot more work and understanding to be done about that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, between the vulnerability of their extra vulnerability, if you like, because of language, because of culture, because of being so far from home. And then had a conversation with Morag Edwards, who's retired educational psychologist, spent a lot of time in the system. She was talking as well about just the loneliness, if you like, the need for love the need for touch, the need for connection, often then drives some of these behaviors, both for the boys and the girls, is desperate. They're love starved and touch starved, and that can lead, to finding it in the wrong places. With each other, with teachers, with groundskeepers, and all the sort of stuff that we've heard, it's very understandable when, and that's something that hasn't changed hugely in the experience today in boarding schools. There is still no appropriate touch. There is still no parent present, and there is all this pressure cooker environment that you referenced.
Could I just add one more thing on that too? It's a university example, but I'm sure it happens at high schools as well. One of the things more than one international student said to me was they would confide in me that if they stayed in the university accommodation, that they felt they were being pressured for non-consensual sex by some of the Australian young men. And they were being told that this is the norm in Australia, this is what people do, if you come to live in Australia, this is how you're going to have to behave. And I suspect there's a bit of that going on with cross-cultural kids and third culture kids who get sent to boarding school in another country too. They don't actually know what the cultural norms are, and it can be very confusing to work out what you want yourself and what's appropriate, and particularly in the circumstances you described too, where everybody's starved for touch and affection.
Thank you. Yeah, that's I mean, boarding school in itself has its own culture, doesn't it? So even if you come from the same culture, once you go in there, all bets are off as far as the outside world. So yeah, that's got to be doubled down again for the third culture kids. I appreciate today we don't have huge amounts of time, so I wanted to start to sort of bring some of these threads together. We did touch a little bit on the schools now would say everything's better now, everything's different, and I would say that the school sponsored institutional violence and abuse stuff has largely dropped away. It's not gone, but it's largely dropped away. What remains is a pressure cooker environment. What remains is, the absence of touch and love. But in your view, what's better, what's changed, and what still needs work? What still needs to happen out there?
So I would imagine that every school in the land now has heating. The food might have picked up. That pastoral care still cannot match what you could have if you were in your family of origin home. You must still be being brought up by similarly wounded peers. You cannot go home at night. It is a 24-hour pressure cooker. And for children from overseas, as I did, you just can't go home. Exeats, half terms, all of those I spent bouncing around unwilling relatives. I don't think the underlying relational needs have improved or changed at all from my day. And I wouldn't send a dog to boarding school, echoing Bowlby.
Thank you, Nikki. Those strong words, and but I hear where you're coming from on that. Linda, anything to add to that?
I think I would agree with everything that Nikki said, and I think the boarding part is really the problem, isn't it? Because there just isn't enough adult supervision to keep children safe, and they're not being looked after by people who love them. They're being, as Joy Shavarian said, fostered with strangers that don't love them, and I find it really hard to think that that's changed significantly. It's such a huge part of the financial cost to have enough adult supervision and to train those supervisors so that they provide good care and good pastoral care as well as good physical care, and the capacity to see what's going on with a group of children, and the underhand things that are happening, or the things that are happening once you've left the room. I would never have sent a child to boarding school either. I'm not in favour of boarding school for primary school at all. Possibly once you've got to your mid-teens, if it's something that seems to suit everybody in the family. But I think, as Ulrika Endrich says in our book, you still need to have that relationship with a parent where if it's not turning out to be safe, you can actually say that and the parent will take it seriously, and together you will find another solution.
That's really powerful words, Linda. Thank you so much. And yeah, I think for today, because of time, we'll have to leave it there. But it's been an amazing conversation. So just to remind everyone, Exploring Boarding School Challenges for Women and Third Culture Kids Worlds Away from Home is available now at all good bookstores and online and all the rest of it. It's a brilliant book, and it's full of heartfelt and engaging sort of personal stories, and also, of course, with Linda's lens on it, creating an understanding around those stories. So any final thoughts before we sign off, or all good?
Good. Thank you for the opportunity, Chris. Much appreciated.
It's been a real pleasure, and I've learned a lot through the discussion and through your work. So bless you, and thank you for sharing your own stories, for bringing others together, for creating the book, and for your ongoing work. You've got people still writing to you, and I know that they'll at least feel heard, that there's someone out there that's listening. So finish there today. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening or watching. I've been with Linda Devereux and Nicky Moxey. This is the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series, and really look forward to seeing you on the next one. So thank you very much, and go well.
Thank you.